Thank you, Chairman Bono-Mack. Commissioner Ramirez, I want to follow up on some questions or an area that Mrs. Bono-Mack had done regarding harm to consumers. And does the Commission, or can the Commission provide specific examples of actual harm, or are we talking more of hypotheticals?
The harms that we're concerned about are not speculation. We have heard public reports of activities along the lines of the hypothetical that I used in my opening statement is actually happening. Insurance companies, for instance, today are developing models by which they can assemble information that's available to them through this aggregation of data that we've been discussing as a means of substituting what formerly would be more complicated underwriting analyses. So the potential is clearly there. There are public reports that these things are happening today.
Are you able to provide to us evidence or documentation of those specific harms?
The FTC, we're certainly happy to work with you to provide more details and information about those harms.
All right. Is there, as we look at this, before we look at additional regulations or we look at information, should the federal government be required to show what significant consumer harm exists to justify the type of additional costs that we could be talking about when it comes to market regulation on privacy or do not track legislation that might impose upon businesses?
I believe that if Congress decides to move forward with legislation, certainly one has to take into account the implications for all relevant stakeholders, yes. Have
you done any analysis of that potential cost?
What?
The cost to businesses for that?
Again, we have solicited comments and have received over 450 comments from industry, consumers, and other stakeholders. We do have a Bureau of Economics that's involved in our review, and we'll be putting out recommendations later this year.
Okay. And do you have a time frame later this year?
Later this year.
When you think that might be?
I'm afraid
okay.
I can't be more specific.
We'll give you that much wiggle room.
Appreciate it.
Can you tell me how much we know about what information internet sites collect about users, and how much do we know about the sharing of that information? I know we've covered that some in this hearing, but can you enlighten us?
I'm afraid that I can't quantify the scope. What I can tell you is that there is clearly a need for the principles that we're advocating. There's clearly a need for greater transparency. There's a greater need for companies to take into account privacy protections when they provide services and products to consumers, and a greater need for simplified choice.
You know, some critics have expressed concern that self-regulatory schemes could constitute a barrier to entry, perhaps erected by more powerful market participants against smaller and newer companies. How do we guard against such a result as that?
I do think it's a concern, and that one has to take into consideration the impact on small and medium-sized businesses. It's an issue that the agency is looking at very closely, and we do intend to address the issue in our final report.
And what would be the best alternative to self-regulation? What is that going to work?
Well, that's an issue that I think you will have to ultimately decide on as to whether or not legislation is needed. But if there is, if one is to rely on self-regulation, what I will say is it is very important that there be an enforcement element. There has to be accountability, and I think the FTC ought to play a role in enforcement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.